My name is Greg Snyder. I'm one of the co-founders of Safe Central Florida. And on behalf of myself and Karen Lane, who you see in a picture there, and her husband, Daryl Lane, who's in the background, and Diane Chechio, the four of us round out the executive team for Safe Central Florida. And we're a organization or an alliance of nonprofits and law enforcement and champions, community partners, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. The objective of today is to share with you the problem of human trafficking here in Central Florida, and Diane will run through that. Talk about some of the critical needs of some of the surveys we have done. I'll lead with that, and then along with Karen, we'll talk about some of our initial projects that we have are funding to fill some of those strategic gaps. And then we'll talk a little bit about what Safe Central Florida is doing and how potentially you could participate in joining the team to fight human trafficking here. And we'll set up a good bit of time left over for question and answer. And one housekeeping item on the bottom of your screen, you should, if you just kind of hover over the bottom, you should see a little tab that says Q&A. If you could type in the Q&A session there, then we will, at the end of the presentations, we will get to as many questions as we possibly can. I think that's probably a little easier for us than chat. If you by mistake hit chat, don't worry, we'll watch that as well. But I think the Q&A is probably a little easier function to do. So what I'd like to do to kick off, just give you maybe a couple of minute introduction here via a video. So if here's a video on what SAFE is all about and a little bit of our history.
The reaction I get when I talk about human trafficking is it's want to get one of two responses. One is people that have become aware of it, said, yes, I know it's a big problem around the world. But for the most part, hardly anybody knows that human trafficking is a huge problem here in Central Florida. When I quote the statistics that say that human trafficking on a per capita basis, Orlando is the third worst city per capita for human trafficking in the United States, 99 out of 100 people are amazed. People do not know that human trafficking is such a problem here in Central Florida.
As a former prosecutor of human trafficking cases, I can tell you that human trafficking is a problem in Central Florida. My first human trafficking victim recovered was from Seminole County. The sheriff at the time did not have a human trafficking task force. They just weren't aware that this is a crime that actually occurs locally. Almost all of my victims were United States citizens and were from the local Central Florida area.
I'm Karen Lane.
I'm Daryl Lane.
And together with Greg Snyder, we co-founded Safe in Central Florida. And along with Diane Chechio, we round out the executive committee for Safe in Central Florida.
Safe in Central Florida is an alliance of frontline partners, law enforcement agencies, community partners, and individual partners that come together to identify the greatest need in the fight against human trafficking here in Central Florida.
The SAFE model starts with an alliance of community partners, individual champions, and the nonprofits in the fight, as well as law enforcement, working together. From there, you devise an advisory council, work designing the gaps that we see in Central Florida in this fight. From there, then we get requests for quotes from our alliance partners to see if they have a solution. And then we go about funding those solutions.
The SAFE Alliance is a great business model. What it takes is it looks at the intelligence and the experience of nonprofits already in the fight against human trafficking here. And that's where SAFE comes in. It brings together the nonprofits with their needs with fresh resources, be it financial resources, be idea generation, collaboration with other nonprofits to come up with the most strategic projects that can make a difference in our community.
We feel very honored to be a part of this. We watch the nonprofits who are working so hard every single day. And if we can come alongside and help encourage, help them to collaborate, help us to move the needle, it's almost overwhelming to us that we can play a small part in that.
It's a very humbling experience to come alongside our partners that are out there day to day working to either rescue victims of human trafficking or help the survivors take their next step towards healing.
I know that it's very popular to say go big or go home, but I am here to tell you that every little part that you do, every little thing that you can provide or volunteer time or volunteer money or just educate yourself and educate other people about this crime, it's going to make a difference.
That kind of gives you an overview of Safe Central Florida. We are surprisingly only a little over 2 years old. It's been a crazy 2 years, especially with all the COVID stuff going on. We have over 60 Alliance members already. And as Karen kind of went through the process a little bit, we've done our initial needs analysis, identification of gaps, and our first phase of an RFP, request for proposals, issued 5 grants, and we'll kind of go through that a little bit afterwards. But before we get into kind of the solution, I'd like to ask Diane to maybe talk a little bit about the problem here in Central Florida and her experience with, and she's been doing this for years and years and years, and I think you can get some great insight from Diane on the fight here in Central Florida. So I'll turn the screen over to Diane Chechio.
Thank you, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know everyone is incredibly busy, so we really do appreciate you taking the time to collaborate with us today and to listen to what SAFE is all about. As Greg said, my name is Diane Chechio. I am a former assistant state attorney and former assistant statewide prosecutor. My office was based in Orlando, but statewide prosecution has jurisdiction in all 67 counties in the state of Florida. And I specialized or focused on prosecution of human trafficking cases. I have over 20 years of criminal experience, and I do assure you that this crime is here locally, and I had too many cases to manage. So if we're gonna start our slideshow. The challenges, let me start with a few challenges in human trafficking cases. And this list is by no means exhaustive. There are countless challenges to recognizing human trafficking, rescuing the survivors, prosecuting the cases, and providing aftercare for the survivors. But I just want to talk about a few of the challenges that we faced here in Central Florida. One of the challenges is a lack of training. Florida didn't have a real human trafficking statute with teeth until about 2012. And this took a lot of training for local law enforcement offices and NGOs or non-governmental organizations who were trying to help in the fight. There was a learning curve. For example, we learned that putting human trafficking survivors or rescued human trafficking victims with domestic violence shelters didn't really work out well, right? Because the two are very dissimilar, and the survivors and the victims just did not get along. So there was a learning curve on what we did and how we did it, and to teach law enforcement how to investigate those crimes and how long the investigations take. It's very rare that a human trafficking victim will walk up to a uniformed law enforcement officer and say, "Hey, I'm a human trafficking victim and I need help." I don't think I've ever had that happen in quite that way. And because the reality is most of the time they don't self-identify as human trafficking victims. And so these investigations, they require a lot of legwork by law enforcement, and they require a lot of investment on the back end from non-governmental organizations providing services to make sure once the victims are rescued, they're not falling back into what they will refer to as the game, the prostitution, spending the money, living the life, using the drugs, which is a very common way for traffickers to control their victims, is to get them hooked on a controlled substance. They will refer to that as the game. And like I said, the victims are really challenging. They don't self-identify. They form a trauma bond with their victim. With their trafficker. I had many victims tell me, that's not my trafficker. I'm not a victim. That's my boyfriend. I do this because I love them. And I actually had a victim on the stand once in a trial, and I asked her, after she told me this, what would happen if you told him that night that you did not want to do dates? And that's a slang or euphemism for prostitution or tricks. And she said, well, I told him that once and he broke my nose. So that's one of the challenges that we face as well. Lack of funding and resources is another challenge. Prosecuting these cases wouldn't be possible without funding from non-governmental organizations who help provide care and placement for these survivors. And that, of course, is going to require money. There are immigration issues associated with human trafficking victims. Some, not all, but some, will be non-US citizens. As the video indicated, more than 80% of the human trafficking victims here in Central Florida have been born US citizens. And most of my victims that I dealt with were born in the United States, actually born here locally and trafficked here locally. But with immigration issues, only the federal government can grant a stay via a T or U visa, or a continuous presence. There are several other immigration options, but for the most part, those are solely within the discretion of the federal government, making it that much more difficult to prosecute these cases at the state level. And lastly, there's an evolving modus operandi. And what I mean by that is traffickers are not stupid criminals. They don't plan these things on a whim. They're very sophisticated, and they use very sophisticated methods to entice and groom and solicit their victims, and then use very sophisticated methods to traffic their victims. We used to have a web page called Backpage that you would post an ad for a date in exchange for roses, which is a euphemism for money. And Backpages was actually taken down in a criminal case and prosecuted criminally in several states, because what we discovered through Senate hearings was that that particular company was actively modifying the ads that the traffickers were posting to try to avoid law enforcement detection. And once you cut off one head, two more pop up. And so there can be solicitation or recruitment online. There can be recruitment on social media, chat, Snapchat, Instagram. The possibilities are endless. Next slide. And one of the challenges as a prosecutor, and one of the challenges of educating the public, is why don't people ask, why don't they just leave? Why didn't you just call the police? Why didn't you ask a date for help? And these are all valid questions. My victims were not tied up. They were not locked in. They were not behind bars or chained up. They were, we like to refer to mental chains rather than metal chains. And I will give you an example. I was at a conference with a survivor who was trafficked while she was 14 and 15 years old. And she was asked in this audience of about 300 law enforcement officers at this conference, did anyone ever ask to help you or offer help, or did you ask for help? And she sincerely thought about it for a minute, and she answered this way. She said, one time when I was on a date, and that's a prostitution exchange, that she was being trafficked for when she was 15 years old, the date handed her a business card and said, I think you may be in trouble. I think you may need help. If you ever need anything, please call me. And then he finished his date and he left. And the business card was for a deputy sheriff. So this is another problem with why they don't ask for help. One, they're taught to distrust law enforcement, but two, this crime crosses all socioeconomic planes. It crosses every racial plane. There is no one that cannot be trafficked and no one that is not a customer. Politicians, law enforcement, ministers. So these victims understand that there's really not a safe place to ask for help. Next slide. The other issue we run into is what we refer to as a trauma bond. And Patrick Carnes terms this definition for a trauma bond. But I want to share with you a letter that was written by one of my human trafficking survivors. In the state of Florida, victims have a right to give, in any case, not just human trafficking, but all cases where they're a victim, an impact statement. They're allowed to tell the judge how this crime has impacted their life, and they're allowed to address the defendant about how they feel and what they think should happen. And that particular individual that I just referenced wrote an impact statement for the court, and I will read you an excerpt of what this trauma bond looks like. She wrote this letter after a year of counseling in a residential program, and that is full-time, hands-on, 12 months of trying to break this trauma bond with this individual. She says, "Dear," and she puts his name, "I really miss you a lot. No matter how many times you hit me and hurt me, you were the first man to comfort me and take care of me. You might not have truly loved me, but you acted like it. You let me get sexually abused. You physically and emotionally abused me. From this point on, I am letting you go and breaking the bondage between us." She goes on to say, "Nobody can hurt me more than you've hurt me. You showed me how it feels to be hurt and not cared about, and showed me how it feels to be all alone. I'll never make that mistake again. Like you, that would be treated so badly and hurt me so much. I'm a lady. I deserve way better than being beat and abused." And she signs the letter to her trafficker, "I love you, but goodbye forever." And that's the type of mentality or trauma bond that we are working to break when we're working with human trafficking survivors. Next slide, please. So what can you do about human trafficking? I want everyone to peek out their camera or their phone right now and snap a picture, please, of this slide. Because the most important thing that you can do from the start is to recognize the signs, and we'll talk about those in a minute, and call these hotlines. It would be much better for you to mistakenly call in something you suspect to be human trafficking than to allow potential victim to go on being abused because you're afraid to call. If you see something, say something. And these are the numbers that you want to call. Next slide, please. Okay, what are the signs of sex trafficking? It's very common for traffickers to take driver's license, school IDs, travel documents, passports from their victims. It's hard to get around without your identification. We've all left home without our wallet, and we know how difficult it is to just go through your regular daily routine without identification. Do the victim's answers to any questions seem rehearsed or coached? When you're asking the victim something directly, are they looking up at their trafficker for a cue before answering? Do they seem fearful, or are they combative? I had a human trafficking victim physically fight law enforcement upon arrest because she knew that when she got out, and she did, her trafficker was going to beat her, and he did. Does the victim appear malnourished or sleep deprived? Lots of these victims are forced to do 30, 40, 50 dates a day, and they are exhausted and they're not getting any sleep. And they're given drugs to help them continue to be trafficked. Does the victim know his or her address? That's a clear sign, because if they're traveling from city to city, If they're in hotel after hotel after hotel, they won't be able to tell you what their address is. Next slide. Is there a big age difference? Lots of times trafficking victims are going to be much younger than their traffickers. That's not always the case, but it's a good red flag. Is the victim calling the person that they're with my boyfriend or daddy when that really appears to be an inappropriate reference? Does the victim refer to the suspected trafficker as King? King is a very common name for a trafficker of juveniles. Does the victim have any tattoos? And it's actually a criminal statute in the state of Florida to brand victims. That traffickers do that quite frequently. They will put their name on their victim. I had a case where we found 24 victims with this individual's name tattooed in some form on their body. Does the victim have any injuries or bruises? Look at their arms for grab marks. It's rare that their faces are touched because the trafficker knows that's where the money is. But look at their arms and their legs for bruises. Are there locks on interior doors? I had a case once where the windows in the bedrooms were nailed shut. You could see that from the outside, from the street, if you just bothered to look. It was actually visible from the outside. So those are just a few of the signs that you're going to want to look for. Next slide, please. Okay, now that this victim has been rescued, what do we do? Next slide. We have both emergency services and long-term services. So next slide, our basic needs. Typically when human trafficking victims are recovered, they're in nothing but the clothes on their back. They have no personal belongings. The cell phone was given to them by their trafficker. Their clothes were given to them by their trafficker who controls everything. So they're going to need food. They're going to need clothing. They're going to need housing. They may need immediate medical attention. I had a human trafficking victim once that was positive for cystic fibrosis. And she was in and out of hospitals. And that's the only way we found her. Every time she was released from the hospital, she would go back into the game. She would get sick, get picked up, we'd pick her up in the hospital. Once she was released, she would go back into the game. Are there mental health issues? Human trafficking survivors are some of the strongest women I have ever met. I think a public perception is that they're weak and that's why they were trafficked, but they endure some of the most horrific abuse. But it also leaves mental scars. It leads to PTSD and other mental health issues. And so make sure that there's not a bipolar or schizophrenic issue that we're dealing with that's urgent. Interpreters and translators, if they don't speak English, then you're going to need an interpreter and you're going to need a trusted interpreter. We had a case once in court where the interpreter was actually feeding information to the trafficker and the interpreter was not appropriately translating what was being said. And so make sure you have a trusted translator. Education and care for children, Department of Children and Families for children in the state of Florida, take care of that. Excuse me. And then family reunification. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Once we tend to their immediate needs, we move on to long-term residential programs that specialize in trauma-informed care. This means that we don't work on their testimony for trial. We don't work on reunification with their family if they're not ready. We work on their trauma. We address their trauma bonds and their initial needs. And we also want to educate them because eventually when they are released, they will need a job that pays well enough for them to support themselves. I've had several victims complete long-term residential programs who struggled financially to find a job with livable wages and eventually told me they had no other choice but to resort to prostitution again because of the money. Next slide, please. Keep in mind location of these programs. I've had more than one survivor in the Central Florida program, in several programs in Central Florida. shimmy out windows, sneak outdoors. Location is important when you're deciding where to place survivors. And keep in mind that there is no privilege like an attorney-client privilege or a husband and wife privilege. So when you are interacting with these survivors, what they tell you, you can be testified, can be called to testify about in court. There is a relocation assistance program for human trafficking victims. They can receive up to $1,500 in funds from the state of Florida to relocate if they choose to do that. And there's the number and the webpage for any NGOs or human trafficking survivors that want to apply for that aid. Next slide, please. Lastly, I would be remiss in saying, if you are working in this field and you have boots on the ground, you have contact with survivors, you're law enforcement, you're an NGO, or you're just a friend, make sure that you are finding ways to decompress. Make sure you are taking care of yourself. You cannot comfort and give a survivor comfort if you are not feeling comforted yourself. You can't give away what you don't have. So please remember, take some time to take care of yourself while you're working in this space, because it can be very stressful. I've always found the saying, it takes a village. You alone will not be able to eradicate this crime, but together, if we pull our resources together and work together, I believe that can be accomplished. Thanks, Greg.
Good. Thanks, Diane. Appreciate that. Okay, so you can see we have a significant problem here. A lot of challenges that Diane went through in kind of at a high level. But let me kind of share what when we went out into the nonprofits that we call frontline partners in the SAFE Alliance, which number about half the alliance members, so 25, 30 alliance members of frontline partners. We did a critical needs analysis and survey, and I'd like to kind of go through what that survey indicated for this area, and then ask Karen to come and talk about maybe some of the initial projects that SAFE is funding that meet many of those needs. So by far and large, the biggest need that was described was housing. We have it, you know, if you're in the Orlando area, you know that the housing, it was a problem before housing went up and skyrocketed in terms of pricing. With all the people moving into Central Florida, there's a shortage of housing. Prices for rent are extremely high, and as Diane pointed out, if you're coming out of a residential program, you even with training and job skills, it's very difficult to find a livable wage position, entry position that is affordable here. So our frontline partners identified short-term housing beds and long-term housing needs, and maybe even kind of a transition independent living housing solution as critical needs in our area. And that is something that we have addressed in one of our projects and will continue to address, because we've just scratched the surface in the housing challenge. Another major area that our frontline partners shared, and with input from survivors, is employment, and how do you come out of a program and find a livable wage. So we have nonprofits, frontline partners that are working with job training programs and mentoring programs, but coming into a safe, livable wage employment opportunity for survivors is critical to allow them to take the next steps in terms of their recovery. And part of that is just self-worth and all that, so they're not getting sucked back into the world that they came out of. And another need was just kind of the basic needs. Diane went through the needs that when a young woman or a young man is rescued, they have nothing. So a need was, how do you start rebuilding some things, some basic needs that they need, be it food and dental care and medical care, identification. As Diane pointed out, first thing traffickers do to their victims is take their driver's license away, birth certificates, passports, whatever. How do you do anything in this world without ID? So that was another need that was identified by our team, our alliance members and the frontline partners. So that's kind of the high level projects that were identified as short-term needs. And then we went back out to those frontline partners recently and basically reconfirmed that the same needs that were there last year are still current needs. So let me hand off to Karen for a minute and let her talk about maybe some of the initial projects that SAFE is funding, with an overview strategy of SAFE of we don't want to become provide operating funds for year after year for programs. We really want to help programs kick off, complete. If we identify a need that nobody's basically addressing, and proof of concept. If you have an idea or nonprofits have an idea of proof of concept, then maybe they can't get normal funding. So Karen, can you kind of talk about the first phase of projects that we've kicked off recently, and then we'll kind of go into some discussions on next steps.
Okay, certainly. So as Greg alluded to, that he said housing was one of the top gaps that we see in Central Florida. And so in one of our projects that we granted, we actually put out the request for quote, received 7 project requests. We granted 5 of them. And one of them was specific to the housing topic, whether a certain organization is trying to expand their ability to support transitional housing after that first wave of in-depth trauma support, moving into that next stage of heading toward independence. So we supported that one. He mentioned employment. So we also provided a grant to an organization that was expanding their capabilities in order to hire more survivors. So part of that was to work their marketing protocol and expand how they're actually funding. And we gave them some initial support for the next survivor they've helped. So we felt like that was a really good niche for what we were looking to do. Greg and both Diane talked about the basic needs section. So we also provided a grant to an organization that is what they do is they get in there and provide documentation back to survivors. It often takes, if they need birth certificates, they have to go back to the state they were born. It can be quite tedious and somewhat time consuming. And this organization, we funded them to help survivors get their ID and get back on their feet from that perspective. Also along the basic need line, we are really thrilled. We got a collaborative project across 3 nonprofit organizations, each that are very good in their specific area, but joined together. Their goal is to have a more holistic continuum of care so that the same case manager takes them through the entire process from, the initial getting out and getting the basic needs met, and then moving into residential treatment and getting mentoring to come alongside you, trauma support, training for jobs, and come out the other end with job. And you're working with the same core case manager as a continuum, which right now most organizations all are doing a great job, but they have their niche. And when they're niche, they kind of hand off to somebody else who does that next phase or whatever. So I'm really excited about that. And as Greg mentioned, this is a proof of concept one. These organizations had actually already gone to their funding providers as a part of their normal protocol. And we're told that it sounded like a great idea on paper, but they were concerned about never having seen organizations work, across organization lines. So we are providing that proof of concept for them to then go ahead and incorporate into their ongoing protocol and fundraising. As Greg says, we do try our goal is to get things done that they can't get done right now, and then they have a way to continue it after they've implemented the project with us. And then we actually started the 5th project that we approved a grant for. It's very interesting. As we worked with our alliance partners, we kept hearing that everybody had their own little resource directory. people or organizations that they felt comfortable with. They felt they had vetted them. They felt comfortable calling them, and everybody had their own spreadsheet. And so we got to talking as a group that what if we could make this a little more, universal? So one nonprofit stepped up to that, and they've been interviewing everybody, setting up a protocol and who gets in the directory. They may be alliance partners, they may not be, but if they provide a resource that is needed or a service that is needed in this arena, and they're right now it's in the hands of IT, and they're developing a program that will at least be web-based, possibly application-based, could be on your phone, to make it a little bit easier to get through all of those things. And instead of getting to one person, they pull out their spreadsheet and start making phone calls. So real excited about this. All 5 projects have been kicked off as of the end of last year. So they're all in process. Some are shorter than others. Some will probably take 9 months to a year. Other ones are pretty much already on the final stretch. So we're really excited about that. So I think
Good.
great.
Do we envision, Karen, a similar set of RFPs going out later this year and try addressing the same sort of problems in the future?
Yes, I envision that we'll somewhere in the next few weeks or next month or two, we've been doing a lot of research around some of these topics as we try to expand our grants and expand the reach. And every year we learn more. So we also want to be very diligent. And so we're doing a lot of research on the housing. What makes sense for that? Does it make sense to try to work with somebody and have them build a new facility? Or is it, how many beds do you have? And so we've visited a couple of places that are actually doing it, and we're learning from them. Not that we're going to mandate in the RFP by any stretch, but we felt we wanted to have more knowledge as we put the RFP together around housing. And then when they come in, that we're that much more educated as to what project over another may make the most sense based on, their planning, against the learning that we're doing. So I feel very comfortable. We'll get probably something on housing again. I know we've talked to some, have already talked about, they have some employment ideas.
Mhm.
I would say one of the newer things we've just started really discussing and researching is around the topic of demand. How do you reduce demand? So that may even be one of the options that we'd like to see some sort of a project put together on.
Great, thanks.
And,
One thing that we'd love to do as an alliance, and that is bring people into, is to collaborate together and understand what services are out there. Obviously, we put together a directory of services, but we're also going to put together a survey that goes out to all of the frontline partners and to just really get an idea of what capabilities are out there. And with the help of another nonprofit that studies these sort of things, we're going to be issuing a survey to the nonprofits in this space to get a handle on what services are out there, what and how do they prioritize the needs, again, within their space, not just in the overall movement. So over the next couple of weeks, we'll have information like that. And the reason for putting those together is that then we can share that data, those statistics in an area that has very little data out in public, because it is a very dark, secretive world, and present that to foundations and churches, and we were always looking for new resources to bring to our frontline partners. So I think that's one thing that SAFE is doing is collaborating within groups, and also raising the level of attention to the fight and all of the great frontline partners that are in the space. And we'll try to do that with a little bit of a little more of a business background, so that we can approach businesses and foundations and larger organizations like churches with facts to express just how big the need is and how they can get involved. So, Karen, you want to talk a little bit about maybe different ways people can get involved?
Sure. I'd just like to add on to that with Greg as well. When it's human common sense, if you've ever donated, to kind of understand the organization you're giving to, or the fight, or whatever it is you're donating money to. And this area is just really difficult because there's so much secrecy around it. Sometimes people have asked us, how big is the problem? Well, I think, Greg, what is your response to that? Now he's come up with a really good response to that.
I mean, I tell people, you know, there certainly, and Diane can comment here, there are hundreds and hundreds of victims out there. You know, all you can do look at is the number of calls into the hotline, and we kind of mentioned that Florida is the number 3 state in the country, and number of cases tried, and it's I mean, the statistics are small. I mean, the numbers are big, but the true facts that you can go to somebody and say that you can't go out and say that there are, you know, 1,118 young women and young men that are being trafficked right now. But we can kind of get orders of magnitude, but we're trying to figure out how to get more and more information on that.
So again, as we share that with you, one, to educate you on that, and also as people ask you the same thing, it's just like, you know, domestic, you know, abuse or, you know, child abuse in the home. Nobody really knows how big it is, and it's going to be hard to do that. But on to next steps. Yes, we really, really appreciate your taking time for this call. We know everybody's busy. And then when you kind of even start to wrap your head around this problem, as we started this 2 or so years ago, we were like, okay, it's too big. It's just too big. What do we do? What can we do? But if you notice, Diane in the opening video did say that, you know, whatever we can do, it's worth it. You know, whatever little bit that you can see your way clear to do or help or provide does make a difference. So I wanted to give you some specifics around that. So get your pencil out. First thing first is, let me give you my email address. So it's Karen@safecentralflorida.com. So a lot of these actions will be just getting back in contact with me. The first one is, this may be your first time you've even heard about SAFE. And if that's the case, and you would like to have a little better understanding and a little more detail than we provided today, please email me. We'll be glad to set up a meeting and talk through with more detail on that so you can actually understand it better. We would like to keep the dialogue open with all of you if you so choose. And to do that, I would appreciate just sending a quick email to me saying, here's, you know, please use my email address and attach it to your newsletter. We try to keep communications down. We know a lot of nonprofits and whatever we've all given to, and we get weekly stuff. We do a monthly newsletter, and a couple times a year we'll send out an extra one. So we try to keep the flow into your email at a reasonable level. So if you would just email me that we'd like to be included in our communications, that'd be great. Third, if you are already, maybe this is your third or fourth approach to SAFE, you just see it and you see the vision, then you can go to our website, which is safecentralflorida.com, and then click into join us, and then you can apply. If you're a nonprofit or law enforcement or working in this field, you would go into the nonprofit bucket. If you're an individual, interested just as an individual, go under individual champions. And if you're a business or a church, you can apply under community partners. I want to let you know that the application is very short. It's like 3 questions, and there is no cost to do this. It's basically to see that you have a heart for this, you're willing to collaborate, because that's one of the big things that SAFE does. It brings people together so that we can take that village and do more together. Speaking of, you know, churches, organizations, a lot of our community partners are churches. So if you happen to be a member of a church that you think might be interested in partnering with Safe in Central Florida, then we'll have you email Greg, which is greg@safecentralflorida.com. If you should feel like to donate, of course, you can go to our website and then click on the donate button. Do want to let you know we follow the 100% contribution model, so that all the money that goes to that fund goes directly to all the strategic projects that we decide on. And we have a separate fund that takes care of the administrative stuff that we are doing as SAFE. But as an alliance model, since we're not a 501c3, we are very lean and can keep our costs down. If perhaps you're interested in more direct support to the organizations directly in the fight, we can give you some direction there as well. We can help point you to training or options and opportunities there. So you can email me with that question. And I guess last, but certainly not least, as Greg mentioned at the very beginning of the video, so many people are unaware. So you're aware now, so you can't turn away. So now you either need to decide to join us or join somebody and continue your education, and then be able to share and clarify that this is happening to others.
Great. Thanks, Karen. I'd like to transition over to some Q&A now. If you have questions, I've got a couple here. If you could jump on and type a couple questions, we will try to get to those because we have roughly 10 minutes or so left. And let me start with the first question is to Diane. Is it, you talked about the statutes in Florida kicking in 2012. How is Florida catching up, or how are we doing now in terms of legislation and support for survivors? What's our grade? How are we doing as a state?
Well, our grade went up, and then we stopped studying, and our grade went back down again. So we, for criminal statutes prosecuting human traffickers, we're doing fantastic, right? Our statute models that of the federal statute, and we're doing very well. And we also abrogated the juvenile prostitution statute, which makes perfect sense. For the longest time, and to be quite frank, even as a prosecutor 20 years ago, I was prosecuting juveniles for prostitution. But that makes no sense, right? Because juveniles can't consent. So we fixed that. We're no longer prosecuting juveniles for prostitution offenses. And that boosted our grade a little bit. Where we are falling short when it comes to victims in human trafficking cases is our very broad discovery rules in Florida. So in Florida, someone accused of a crime, if it's a felony, which means if it's punishable by more than a year in jail, they have a right to depose the victim and any witnesses. And in a deposition, they have a right to question anything that may lead to inculpable or exculpable evidence. So that means everything's fair game. The victim's sexual history, the victim's childhood, any potential of the abuse. Now, they're not supposed to be abusive about it, but I have been in depositions where I've had to tell the attorneys they have to change their tone or become less aggressive, or I'm going to end a deposition and ask for a protective order, right? And unfortunately, that happens quite frequently in these types of cases. Federally, there isn't the right to depose victims. So as a prosecutor, my first go-to was ask law enforcement, see if the federal prosecutors will take it first, because the victims have so much more protections in federal court. But there is pending legislation under the state attorney in Miami, Catherine Rundle, has been championing the cause to try to get more protections in place for human trafficking victims when it comes to discovery rules.
Okay, thanks. Another question is you mentioned housing as a problem. Do we have an idea of how many more beds we need, and are there any plans to increase the beds in Central Florida? I think Dee Coleman from Samaritan's Village is on. Maybe Dee, are you able to unmute yourself and maybe comment on that? What your experience is in terms of the size of the problem, housing problem here in Central Florida?
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, everybody. The problem, it continues to remain to be grossly under, there are not enough beds. I say grossly underfunded in terms of creating beds. And so, yes, there is. I know from our organization, Samaritan Village, that has been one of our main strategic initiatives over the last couple of years and continues to be. And we see that in the foreseeable future. In the last, even the last decade, I've been at Samaritan Village doing kind of long-term restorative care housing, the housing model for the last 6 years. But even in the last decade, we've gone to, I believe in like 2015, there was roughly maybe 30 beds at best in the state. I believe now we're looking at about 120. But I like to say that when you look at the national numbers of how many victims are identified, it's just not enough beds. So yeah, it's an issue that organizations like ours and others are definitely working to secure more beds. We're also looking at working and collaborating with other organizations to be able to figure out how we can do this in a way that's going to be sustainable for the community. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. So we got a big challenge and not a whole lot of funding going that direction right now. I guess that's what the bottom line is. And if for that person, if you want, if you have some ideas about participating, drop me a note, and we'd love to hear your ideas. Another question is, and this could be probably Diane, you, or maybe even Dee, is what has been the impact of COVID on human trafficking?
Well, I was certainly acquiesce to Dee. She's had boots on the ground more than I have during the pandemic. And so, Dee, would you mind addressing that?
Sure. It's been very interesting. In some ways, we've seen the numbers increase in terms of we're getting more and more referrals that are actually coming from directly from clients, which has been very interesting. And that's something that we'll be looking at, I think, as a community. Whereas prior to COVID, a lot of our referrals were through, as Diane said earlier, through law enforcement and kind of the criminal justice system. COVID had an impact in the sense that it took a lot, what is already considered underground, it took even more of it underground. And so, I tell this kind of mini story of when everything was shut down, we were kind of at the height of the pandemic. We were getting very few referrals, and that to us felt like the calm before the storm. We're noticing now in 2022, almost 2 years later from the initiation of the pandemic, that these numbers are starting to go up. So what that's told us is that for 2 years, things have been alarmingly quiet in the sense that people just weren't reporting. If your job was shut down and you weren't showing up for work, then nobody was reporting you missing. And so the grooming has gone online. I think a lot of the sale of humans have gone online. And so that can make it a little bit more difficult for people that are doing this work on the front lines.
Great, I guess. Good information, not necessarily a good situation. Another question is, can businesses join the SAFE Alliance? And I'll take that as the answer is absolutely. If you're an individual, we'd love to have you join as an individual partner. If you're a business and believe in the importance of fighting human trafficking as a community, you can reach out to me or on our website. We'd love engaging with churches. About half of our support it comes from churches. So if you have a church that is very outreach oriented and very active in the community, and they're not involved in human trafficking or aren't already supporting one of our partners like Samaritan's Village or United Abolitionists, have them reach out to me, and we can either plug them into the SAFE Alliance or, depend on their strategic direction, plug them right into one of our frontline partners. So I think that's the only questions I had. We have probably given people about 3 minutes left of their life. A little bonus here. Any final question or comments, Diane or Karen?
I just would like to say thank you again for taking the time to do this. Awareness is the first step to making some changes and making a difference.
Yeah, and I would echo that sentiment. Thank you very much for getting involved, taking the time to learn a little bit more about this horrific crime, and don't ever feel like you can't make a difference. You can make a difference. Even donating a toothbrush and toothpaste is going to make a difference to a survivor when they don't have that. And so I would just encourage everyone to please get involved and stay plugged in. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Dee. Appreciate all of your help, everybody. And we look forward to continuing to come together as a community, collaborate, and make a dent in the human trafficking problem here in Central Florida. So have a good evening, everybody. Thanks.